Great, thank you, everybody. So I hope you knew what you were getting into when you signed up to watch Strange Brew. And I don't know if I knew what I signed up for when I agreed to give a scientific presentation on Strange Brew. So I am going to do my best to tie the science of beer and brewing to the movie you just watched. So certainly tapping into a lot of different quotes and situations that came up throughout the movie. First, though, we were really happy to bring some samples for you guys to have from the lab. We run a Brewing Science Certificate program at the University of Sciences. I'll tell you just a touch more about that at the end of my talk. But I tasked our brewing manager, Marissa Egan, with trying to come up with a recipe that would capture Strange Brew. And what better way to capture Strange Brew than with beer and donuts? At first maybe we thought we'd try to brew a beer with some mice in it, but then we figured that wouldn't be the best approach, so we went with donuts. So there were no actual donuts in this beer, but it is just a simple ale with some cinnamon, so like a cinnamon donut. There is a touch of lactose if you're trying to avoid lactose. Not a lot, but there is a touch. And so cheers. I hope you enjoy the sample. So if those of you in the audience hopefully drink beer and understand a little bit about what's going on in the brewing world or in the craft beer business, if you've gone and out to dinner lately, you've probably been at some point overwhelmed with the amount of options on any given beer menu these days. And as Braumeister Smith said, you see the brewing business has become very competitive these days. Strange Brew was released in 1983, and at that time in the United States there were only 93 breweries. And if we compare that to today, there's 7,450 breweries. And the crazy thing is, if you look at this trend right here between 2012 and 2018, just what accelerative growth there's been at that time, such that 2 breweries open per day across the country since 2012. It's pretty remarkable. So we are seeing a little bit of a shift in the type of breweries that's opening and in the culture around beer, which I'm not here to talk to you today, but if you certainly have any questions or want to discuss it further at the end of my presentation, I'd be happy to chat some more about it. So, to draw on another quote, do you hear that, honey? They got jobs. They get free beer. To define craft beer, which is really what our program focuses on, training brewers to work in the craft brewing industry, the Brewers Association defines craft beer as the following. Number 1, small annual production of 6 million barrels or less. That's actually a huge number, which was actually increased to accommodate Yuengling, which only covers about 3 million barrels. A barrel of beer, 1 barrel is 31 gallons. So that gives you a little bit of insight into how large of a number that is. And the majority of craft breweries in the United States actually brew less, only a couple thousand barrels per year. Number 2, that the craft beer is independent. That means less than 25% is owned by a beverage alcohol industry member that is not itself a craft brewer, meaning that it is not Anheuser-Busch, Miller Coors, or essentially have a large business conglomerate that owns and operates a brewery. If those of you following along on the news may have saw that Dogfish Head recently was acquired by Boston Beer, which is a really interesting shift in brewing business because both are craft brewers. Boston Beer is the number 2, with Yuengling being number 1, and Dogfish Head was number 13. So we are now seeing some really interesting business transitions in the brewing industry, but they both will stay craft. And then finally, that the definition is that the brewery is a brewer, meaning that they have a TTB brewer's notice from the federal government, and that they make beer. This definition recently changed. It actually had been a little more restrictive in terms of producing beer from traditional ingredients, but for example, Boston Beer brews upwards of 50% now cider and hard seltzers, which are still technically considered malt beverage based on how they brew some of their recipes. And so again, the Brewers Association has been shifting their definitions. But Pennsylvania especially is a great place for jobs in the brewing industry. The Brewers Association always does a great job of tracking statistics and economics. And nationwide, the craft brewing industry has added $76.2 billion to the U.S. economy with more than 500,000 jobs. If we look at Pennsylvania, we actually are the #1 producer of beer by volume, thanks in part to the Yuengling. And so to kick off a little bit more about the science of beer, we'll draw from the quote near the end of the movie. We were wondering, what is wrong with the beer? Is it poison? Could it kill you? Of course, they were talking to the contaminant that Braumeister Smith had put into the beer. But what exactly is beer? There are 4 major ingredients in beer: barley malt, water, hops, and yeast. And I guess if you were to put those 4 ingredients together, let them sit long enough, they would make an alcoholic beverage. And that's probably how alcohol was produced at some point back in history. But really, the brewer, artfully and scientifically skilled, is able to combine all 4 ingredients to make the tasty beverage that you're enjoying today. If we look really quickly at an overview of the brewing process, there are several steps with several distinct stages at which each of the 4 ingredients are added. The first is a hot liquor tank or a hot water tank. Really, the water is heated. It takes energy to heat the water to essentially extract all of the sugars from the barley malt. The barley malt gets milled and it gets added to the mash lauter tun with a hot liquor tank in order to extract those sugars and then also to allow enzymes to break those sugars down into fermentable sugars. The hulls from the barley will be used as a filtration media, and the now sugar water, the pre-beer, we call wort, will be sent to the boil kettle. Here then, the wort will be boiled for upwards of an hour, sometimes more, sometimes less, and the hops will be added during this stage. Depending on when the hops are added, if they're added long in the boil, for 60 minutes for the full boil, they'll contribute to bitterness. If they're added late to the boil or even after the boil, they contribute more to flavor and aroma. So, for example, some of the citrus floral flavors that you might get from IPAs are often from late addition hops. That wort then, after boiled, is quickly chilled. Oxygen is added, and it goes into the fermenter. If you've been to a brewery, if you've been to a brew pub, most of the stainless steel that you see in a brewery is in fact fermenters. This process, the process of making wort, takes maybe 8 to 10 hours, but then it's the yeast that do all the hard work. The yeast will then be added to the wort in the fermenters, and that process can take 1 to 2 weeks. They say that brewers actually make wort, yeast make beer. After a week or two, when the beer is finished fermenting, the beer will be pushed into a condition or bright tank. That was the tank at the very end that Rick Moranis drank all of the beer. Essentially, the beer is chilled and it's carbonated and then held in a tank only for a day or two. It would really only be in that tank for a settling period before going to a bottling or canning line. And so if we look a little bit more closely at the process of mashing, so we're looking at this stage where we're trying to extract the sugars from the barley malt and we're allowing the enzymes to break down those starches. Starch is a really long chain. You can think of it like a necklace. And each of the pearls on the pearl necklace are glucose molecules, one single sugar unit. The whole necklace is starch. And what's happening during the mashing process is there are enzymes from the barley malt that will snip, like a scissors, essentially the chain of pearls. The majority of starch that's in barley malt is actually not just a necklace, but it actually is a branched necklace. So there's lots of branch points. These branch points actually are not subject to degradation by these enzymes. So our amylase enzymes are able to cut only the straight chains, where these branched chains remain intact. What that means is at the end of the mashing process, we're left with a variety of sugars, depending on where those amylases cut the big long chain. So if you end up with one glucose unit, right, obviously that's glucose. If you end up, though, with 2, that's maltose. So when we talk about malt beverages, there's a reason why. It's because actually upwards of 50 to 60% of the total carbohydrate profile of wort is actually maltose, and that's due to the chemistry of how these enzymes actually cut. You might end up with something a little longer like maltotriose or maltotetraose, and there is a small amount of sucrose and fructose, which is unrelated to this process. But you might end up with upwards of 25% unfermented dextrins. We call these branched molecules that are left behind. Remember I said those branches can't be cut? They get left behind as unfermentable dextrins. This is really what contributes to the body or the mouthfeel of a beer. A beer might be described as dry, in which case we actually want to try to remove these as much as possible. Or something might be sweet with a fuller mouthfeel. And in those cases, we typically have a higher amount of these unfermentable dextrins. So the important takeaway here is that yeast will typically be able to ferment glucose, maltose, maltotriose. Anything longer, or certainly these branch chain starches or carbohydrates are not fermentable by yeast, and they remain behind in beer. A lot of the caloric content in beer is ethanol, but this is also a big part of it. And so I mentioned that yeast are able to ferment these carbohydrates. And the way that fermentation is typically tracked is by a change in density. If you have sugar, if you have a water and you dissolve a lot of sugar into it, it's going to be a very dense solution. As the yeast ferment and remove that yeast, the density goes down. And that's typically tracked, and you can see with this dark line here, essentially as a drop in density or specific gravity over time. And an easy way to track fermentation in the brewery is with a hydrometer. Thank you. Those of you who, are there any homebrewers in the audience? Cool, yeah. So fermentation of anything, you may have seen a hydrometer. This is also used to look at density of other fluids. So if you work in a med lab, for example, and do urine analysis, you might look at the density of urine. It's the same principle. There is a device that floats in liquid, and it will settle at its buoyant density. And these are calibrated to tell you essentially what is your density. And so a brewer will track this over time. And so when the liquid is very dense, the hydrometer is floating very high. And as that sugar is removed over time, that hydrometer will drop. And the brewer will monitor that once or twice a day, keeping tabs on it. And if it's a beer that's brewed often and frequently, there should be similar numbers that we're trying to hit at the beginning of a ferment and numbers that we're trying to hit at the end of a ferment. And so this was a scene where Braumeister Smith was doing the most scientific thing we saw in the movie, pulling out a hydrometer and taking a density measurement or a specific gravity measurement. And so there's a little bit of lighting here. You can't really see it, but one of the things that we talk about a lot in our classes is how to do proper measurements. And there's definitely some things that Braumeister Smith is doing wrong in this scene. Number one, you always need to look at this at a level eye. So you would never hold these in your hand. They would always be sitting on a table. Further, he's in the brew house, apparently, and you can see the density of this is incredibly low. So again, if we look back at this would be at the very beginning of fermentation. It should be very high. And then it's not until it's very finished beer that the density would be really low. So probably looking at some yellow water for props for this particular measurement. So back to the quote, we were wondering, what is wrong with the beer? Is it poison? Could it kill you? And in fact, no. Beer, outside of excess drinking, and of course we're dealing with consumption in moderation and enjoying beverages. Outside of drinking in excess, beer cannot harm you unless you have some type of allergy, perhaps, which are typically not severe. But beer is a biologically stable beverage. And that's for a variety of reasons. Number one, as I mentioned in the process, there's a boiling period. So if there was any type of contamination, it's going to be sterilized from a 60-minute boil. Typically 5 minutes of boiling is enough to eliminate any microorganisms. Also, hops, the presence of hops are antimicrobial. So they prevent the growth of a lot of bacteria, as is the presence of ethanol. And then finally, beer being carbonated is in an anaerobic environment. So that means the absence of oxygen. So we're also eliminating the presence of a lot of bacteria that may survive. So there are no known pathogenic bacteria that can grow in beer. And for that reason, they used to say that beer was safer than water. And so beer was a prominent beverage for a long time and still is today. But, again, if you pay attention to any news related to beer and brewing, Left Hand Brewing Company back in 2017 filed a $2 million lawsuit against White Labs, accusing them of selling them contaminated yeast. Now, what does this mean? They sell them contaminated. What does it mean that it's contaminated? Well, beer does not go bad in terms of pathogenic bacteria or yeast, but there are bacteria or yeast that can survive in beer. It won't make you sick, but it may damage the quality of the beverage. And this one particular yeast called Saccharomyces cerevisiae variant diastaticus was actually shown to be able to break down and ferment those dextrins. Remember those unfermentable dextrins that I was drawing attention to earlier with those branch chains? They typically, in an unfiltered beer, these are our branch chain molecules, they'll stay around and stick around in the beer and contribute to caloric content after you ingest it. But in a contaminated sample, like with these little green contaminants, they'll secrete an enzyme that now can break down those dextrins and re-ferment them. And so if this happens in a bottle or a can, you can imagine what's going to happen. One of the byproducts of fermentation is carbon dioxide. So in a closed container, if you start making carbon dioxide, you start pressurizing the container and you start getting ruptured containers. And that's in addition to actual federal violation. So of course, if you're fermenting, you're also making more ethanol, so you can fall outside of compliance in reporting of alcohol by volume. The TTB actually specifies that brewers must, if they're labeling alcohol by volume on their beer, they must be within 0.3%. And so there have been some data that's shown that contamination with this yeast can actually push upwards of even 0.5% alcohol by volume above the label. So one of the things that my lab does that I won't be spending too much time on is develop methods of understanding how this infection happens, why it persists, and ultimately how brewers can detect its presence in the brewery. So we recently invented a microbiological medium called FPDM, Farber Fam Diastaticus medium, which allows brewers to plate beer samples and essentially select for and grow the presence of this diastatic yeast if it's present in beer. But I don't want to bore you with science. Let's get back to the movie. All right, and let's one of my favorite scenes is I think when they made the Hose Head ale. So Hose Head was the name of the dog, and they dropped that beer from the food bowl back into the glass, which to me reminds me a lot of popular style these days called New England IPAs. If you guys familiar with New England IPAs? I see a couple head nods. New England IPAs are essentially a hazy, hoppy, cloudy, turbid beer. We've spent a long time trying to make beer clear, to make it stably clear, and now as craft brewers trying to innovate, change flavors, develop new ideas, we've gone backwards and made things cloudy and turbid. And I thought this was a really fitting picture because these guys are obsessed with Star Wars, and so there was a quote, he saw Jedi 7 times, so this was a New England IPA called Jedi Juice. And just a little bit of a Easter egg. So Agnes McGinnis, who played Rosie, was actually Gold Leader in Star Wars. So there you go. So back to the New England IPA, I mentioned what it is. It's soft bitterness. It doesn't have a lot of of bitterness on the palate because there's no hops added for those 60 minutes of the boil that I was describing. So you're boiling your wort for 60 minutes and not actually adding any hops until you actually cut the flame. And then brewers are adding excessive amounts of hops. So we might be talking 1 to 2 to 5 pounds per barrel. So 5 pounds of hops in 31 gallons of beer is a very big amount. And so the science of haze, what is haze? It's really quite simple in that it is a chemical complex of two things, protein and polyphenols. The polyphenols come from hops. The proteins typically come from barley malt or other sources of starch, oftentimes related to gluten. So for example, one of my friends was looking or asking for recommendations on how to avoid gluten in beer. And if the data is not known for your beer, typically I always recommend don't drink hazy beers for this very reason. Gluten is contributing to one of the key players in the haze proteins. So if you have a beer that's relatively clear, that's not to say it's gluten safe, but I would wager that it is lower in gluten content than a New England IPA, for example. Because one of the ways that New England IPAs are created is by adding more protein and adding more hops. And that often comes in additional sources of starch like oats and wheat, which are known for having high amounts of gluten. And then so changing topics just slightly, looking at another quote of, people can tell what's in beer, eh? Like my brother can tell the difference between beers by what his burps taste like. Made me think of recent Super Bowl commercials, billboards, ads that you may have seen all over the place. And that is the war that Budweiser has had with Miller and Coors, claiming that Miller Lite uses corn syrup, and we don't, right? And this really grinds my gears for a variety of reasons. Number one, a lot of brewers use corn syrup. A lot of brewers use dextrose. We call these things adjuncts. Adjuncts are sources of carbohydrates other than barley malt. Why would brewers use these? Because they're cheaper. So if you're dealing with raw materials that you have to purchase as a brewer, you save money by using a different source of fermentable carbohydrates. And I spent all that time breaking down the wort, the sugar profile of wort, because I wanted to show you what's in corn syrup. Corn syrup's actually made by an enzymatic digestion of corn starch. So you would take your corn, liquefy it, and add a fungal enzyme. It's the amylase, a fungal amylase, very similar to barley, but derived from a fungus. And that's going to break it down, much like in the mashing process. And you end up with a variety of carbohydrates, mostly glucose and maltose with a little bit of maltotriose, and even some dextrins. And the point here is that you're really just adding fermentable carbohydrates when you're adding corn sugar. And the reason why this grinds my gears a little bit more is because there is a negative stigma with high fructose corn syrup. And so certainly we're not dealing with that here. High fructose corn syrup is a different enzymatic method of increasing the amount of fructose. And there is little to no fructose in typical corn syrup. The reason why that's done in high fructose corn syrup is because fructose is sweeter. So this is not high fructose corn syrup. So I worry just at the stigma that this creates with the general consumer in the idea of adding corn syrup as being bad in the brewing process, whereas it's quite normal, and in fact, it's fermented in the beverage. Further, all light beers, to become a light beer like Bud Light, I mentioned a lot of the caloric content comes from ethanol, but some of the caloric content can come from those unfermentable dextrins if you have carbohydrates left behind in the beer. So the way that these brewers are able to eliminate or remove as much carbohydrate content as possible is they are actually adding an amylase themselves. And that, again, that amylase is going to break down those dextrins to make sure that there is more fermentable carbohydrates which are removed during the natural fermentation process. And that enzyme will eventually be degraded or destroyed. It's not active in a finished beer, and because it's inactive, brewers don't actually need to label it as such. And so just a few last scenes to comment on the movie and the science. When I first saw this scene I saw this movie a long time ago and then obviously rewatched it in preparation for our presentation. I died laughing. Because if you're a scientist, if you work in a lab, if you've ever worked in a lab, we always have to sign off on lab safety sheets. And one of the things is do not pipette by mouth. So of course the evil villain in this movie is violating one of the critical rules of lab safety, and that is pipetting by mouth. And then second is here Bob was stuck in the bright tank, filling with carbonated beer. And in fact, he was concerned about drowning and running out of oxygen, but in fact, they would have been asphyxiated by CO2 because this was carbonated beer and all that foam is releasing CO2, and they would very quickly, I think, run out of air. And by the way, anyone know what soakers are? I had to look it up. I'm not Canadian myself. So when you step in a puddle and your foot gets soaked, that's a soaker. So that's a Canadian term. So he had two soakers in there. All right, so finally, Braumeister Smith said, "You must be out of your mind, young lady. It takes experience to run a brewery, and you have none." We run a Brewing Science Certificate program out of the University of Sciences, all-night class. It's a graduate program, 7 courses, 18 credits. We're a career training program for brewers in the industry, and we currently have a 100% placement rate for our graduates in the industry. We've been running for 4 years, looking for our 5th class in the fall. We team teach a lot of our courses. We have an on-site pilot brewery. We have hands-on lab courses in microbiology and quality control. And if you're interested or know someone that might be interested, we do have an open house coming up June 18th. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out on this gorgeous day. And I'd be happy to answer other questions. And if you have had any problems with this presentation, please feel free to request a refund. Thank you.